was involved in politics. I don't know that I would call my father a politician, but he was more of a political science professor who decided at a certain point in time that he would start practicing what he had been teaching in terms of the principles of public service and civic duty. And he really was an exemplar of what it means to be a good and proper politician, somebody who cares about his constituents and tries to do good in order to uplift the community, provide proper services, security, and safety, and good zoning and proper planning for all the building that would go on in the community to accommodate different populations as appropriate. Make sure that there are open spaces and there are parks and green spaces where people can enjoy the scenery and have a proper respect for the environment. And somebody who also stood for principles of honesty and integrity. And he was certainly appreciated very much in that role. So since it also happens to be an election year, and especially in America, with the presidential election lurking, coming up just in a few months, I thought that it would be appropriate for this year's topic to speak about election ethics. Now, I want to make it very clear from the outset that it's not my intention today to endorse a particular candidate or a particular political leader, whether in Israel or in America, or any particular political party. It's simply my intention to speak about what some of the issues are when we consider the halakhic or hashkafic approach towards how a political candidate should behave and how a voter should conduct himself or herself, especially a Jewish voter, when it comes to voting in different elections. What are the ethical standards that are followed? It could be that I'll show my hand a little bit in terms of how I feel about certain things and certain issues, but that's to be expected from anybody who would speak about this topic. But if anything sounds like an endorsement, please, I want to make it clear from the outset that there are no endorsements taking place with respect to this speech. Now, it's instructive that we're in Parshas Matos this week, and the parsha begins with the mitzvah of Hataras Nedarim and the mitzvah of Nedarim in general, of being careful with one's speech. By Deber Moshe Osher Matos of Bnei Yisrael Lemor, Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the heads of the different tribes, and he said, Zeh davar shetziva Hashem lemor. This is what a Kadosh Baruch Hu has commanded. Ish ki dur neder Hashem, a person takes a vow. Pasuk goes on to say, Lo yachel dvaro. You're not supposed to violate your vow. You're supposed to honor your vow. Whatever comes out of your mouth, that you're supposed to honor. Now, in the subsequent ensuing psukim, we learn about Hataras Nedarim for a wife who takes a vow in terms of the husband annulling the vow, a daughter who takes a vow when she's very young, in terms of the father annulling the vow. But we start off by talking about the respect that one is supposed to pay to their speech and keeping their words. Now, there's a question: why was this mitzvah specifically given over to the Roshei Matos? Why was it given over to the princes, the leaders of the tribes? So the Ramban says, well, the Ramban says that maybe it was important that since we're speaking about the possibility of nullifying vows when it comes to a father to his daughter, a husband to his wife, so if you would have this mitzvah given over to the broader population, they would say, oh, it turns out the vows aren't all that important because, look, it's possible to nullify all kinds of different vows. So therefore, they wouldn't take it as seriously. So therefore, the mitzvah had to be given to more responsible individuals. The assumption was that the Roshei Amatos, the leaders of the tribes, would be more responsible. So therefore, it was given over the Chachmei Yisrael, Roshei Shivteim, Limeid HaMishpat, so that they were the ones who were taught this particular mitzvah. Now, the Chassam Sofer, after examining this explanation, the Chassam Sofer says, Lulei de Mistapina. He said, if I wasn't afraid, which usually means that he's going to say something that will be arguing with the preceding authorities from earlier generations. And we know that an Achron, a later authority, is not supposed to generally argue with a Rishon, with the earlier authorities. So the way in which you can still get away with is like saying in the Shabbos Karet, you say, Lulei de Mistapina, if I wasn't afraid, this is what I would say. So the Chassam Sofer says, Lulei de Mistapina, I think that the reason why this mitzvah had to be given over to the Roshei Matos is because specifically with the leaders of the nation, if they don't keep their word, it's a chilul Hashem. It's going to be a desecration of God's name. He even suggests that maybe the Torah is even differentiating and saying a father could annul a young daughter's vow and a husband to his wife, because that doesn't have such a great communal import or consequences. When a communal leader says something, so then that is sacrosanct. That cannot be nullified, because if the vow is going to be nullified, so then it's going to lead to chilul Hashem. The whole story of Tzidkiyahu nullifying a vow he made to Nebuchadnezzar leads to bad things. So therefore, he says that that's the reason why the Roshei Matos are singled out. There are other versions of this Chassam Sofer in which he goes even further. He says that the reason why this mitzvah had to be given specifically, shall we say, to the politicians, to the leaders of the tribes, is because they're less trustworthy when it comes to keeping their word. We know the one thing the politicians do is they make all kinds of promises that they never keep. They say, oh, yeah, when I'm elected, I'm going to move the embassy. Yeah, sure. For a long time, that promise was made and it wasn't kept. That we know politicians make all kinds of empty promises. So therefore, that's why the Torah specifically singles out the Roshei Matos to make it clear that if you're going to be a Jewish politician, then there's a certain integrity that the Torah demands of a Jewish political leader that you are supposed to, in fact, keep your word. This gives us some insights as well into the comments I have actually at the end of the source sheets, a later edition. The Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, in source Mem Test, towards the end, he says that in his Shuvos that the decisions that are made by, let's say, representatives who are elected political leaders, and he applies this even to members of the Knesset, he says that if they enact legislation, it has a strong authority to it in terms of, we have a principle of Dina de Malchus Dina, the law of the land is the law. If there are monetary enactments that are made by a government, often it's considered to be binding. So he says that if you have elected officials where all of the voters decide on particular individuals to represent them, or particular political parties, where they know that there are individuals who are the heads of those parties who will be elected and who will be representing them. So therefore, there is a premise that what they enact is not only something that has some great force because it's coming from the government, but he says it's really coming from the people. The reason it has force is almost like it's a shutvus, it's a partnership, because the people are electing these representatives, and therefore they're saying that we trust these individuals that to have our best interests at heart. So whatever these individuals decide, it's almost as if the entire country, that all of the voters, with respect to every single piece of legislation, it's like they are collectively voting on that legislation that they want it to be binding upon them. So Rabbi Yaakov Ariel came along. Rabbi Yaakov Ariel, we know, very distinguished Rav in Eretz Yisrael, who was once, I believe, a candidate even for the Rabbanut HaRashit. So he says that Hagon Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg lo dam b'mikra shebo netzik nivchar al samach matzah mesuyam. He said, it's nice what the Tzitz Eliezer said, but presumably he's not talking about when you have a political leader who was elected to office based on a certain platform that was being presented, ulafesa shina daitom in a kotze. And then what do you know? After the candidate is elected, they completely change their mind and their position 180 degrees from whatever was the platform that they were running upon. So he says that is what we call ein safek shebamikra kazeh yesh kan mekatos. Says that's considered to be a mekatos. It's a mistaken transaction that can be nullified by the votership, because this isn't what they signed up for. They signed up with the expectation that this person is going to advance a particular agenda, is going to advance certain views, and then the person didn't do it in the end. So he says, not necessarily that he's nullifying the legislation, but he says, says at least in such a case that the votership, the citizenry has the right to insist upon new elections because the elected officials didn't do what they were supposed to do. Now, I would imagine that in most political systems, there wouldn't really be a serious expectation that the politicians are going to carry through necessarily their platforms or their word. Maybe you're hoping that that would be the case, but you wouldn't necessarily think it was a fraudulent election if they suddenly turned around and changed their minds, because this is what politicians do, unfortunately, on a semi-regular basis. However, Rabbi Yaakov Ariel is working with the assumption that, no, there is a certain type of expectation, like the Chassam Sofer says, a certain type of integrity that a Jewish political leader is supposed to have to keep their word, and it's on their basis that they are elected into office. There's an interesting requirement with respect to Jewish political leaders, even a melech, even somebody who's a king of Israel, which is a position which was given to David HaMelech, and then it goes in what we might describe as dynastic inheritance, that it simply goes to the next generation afterwards, and so forth. So the Gemara says, the Gemara in Horios, Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis says, not so fast, that it only goes to the next generation, assuming that the son, typically it would be the firstborn son, would be the oldest son, only if the son is Mamali Malkam Avosav, only if he fills the footsteps, he fills the shoes of his father, that he is at the same level of worthiness and honor as his father was. And the Gemara in Subos, Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Beis, makes it very clear. It speaks about when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was dying, and he was the Nasi of the people. He was the prince of the Jewish people. He was from the family of Hillel, which traced its lineage back to David HaMelech. So he was declaring who the leader would be for the next generation of his children. He had an older child. His older child was Gamliel. So he said, then his next oldest son, or one of his next oldest sons, was Shimon. Rabbi Shimon was the biggest chacham. He was the smartest, the most brilliant of all of them. So he says, Alpha Pisha Shimon b'ni chacham, Gamliel b'ni nasi. He says, even though Shimon is a chacham, Gamliel, he's going to be the nasi. He's going to be the prince after me. He's going to be the leader of the people. So the Gemara asks the question that I don't understand, that Rabbi Gamliel anyway was the oldest. He was the oldest of the children. So we have a pasuk, when Yehoshaphat died, so his Malchus Yehuda went to his eldest son Yehoram, because Yehoram was the eldest son. So obviously the Nesius of Rebbe would go to Rabbi Gamliel and not to Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara answers, no. The reason was because Yehoram, at least the time that he became Melech, not afterwards, was Mamale Makam Avosav. He was worthy for the role. But Rabbi Gamliel, he didn't fulfill all of the criteria of his father. He didn't step fully into the shoes of his father. He wasn't Mamale Makam Avosav. So that's why the Rebbe had to say that even though Shimon's a chacham, I'm still appointing Gamliel. So the Gemara says, well, why did he still appoint Gamliel? If Rabbi Shimon was more of a chacham, he more filled his father's shoes. So why did he appoint Rabbi Gamliel? So the Gemara says something very important. Even though Rabbi Gamliel didn't have the same chachma, didn't have the same sharp intellect, wisdom as his brother Rabbi Shimon, he had to have some intellect, obviously, but nonetheless, he did fill his father's shoes in terms of his Yiras Shamayim, in terms of his fear of God. So the Gemara makes it very clear that the idea, what's the chief criterion? Chief criterion for a leader of the people, for a political leader, is to be somebody who has Yiras Shamayim, somebody who is God-fearing. That's why Rabbi Gamliel was given the role by his father, Rebbe, even though he didn't have the same degree of Chachma as his brother. I would like to suggest that this is really pretty much explicit in the Torah. It's explicit in the Torah. So the Torah says in the parasha of appointing a king, Torah says, you're going to say you want to appoint a king, so you'll appoint a king. that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will choose Mikarev Achecha from amongst your brethren, etc., etc. Then the Torah goes on to say that the king has to write a special Sefer Torah. He has to have a Sefer Torah that he keeps in his treasury, that he keeps in his palace. Then a Sefer Torah Mishnah Torah Zos, the second Sefer Torah that he carries around with him wherever he is. And the pasuk goes on to say, "L'man yilmad liyiras Hashem Elokav," in order that he will remember to fear God. We see right over here that the most important feature for the Melech, why it is that he has to have the Sefer Torah all the time, that he's always going to be reading from, is in order to fulfill the mandate of the Melucha. What is the major mandate of the Melucha? L'man yilmad liyiras Hashem Elokav, that he'll have a proper fear of and reverence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In fact, there's a famous Drasha Saran that I have in the sources, number 11. The Drasha Saran says that there really are two systems of justice that we have in Jewish government. There's a system of justice which is run by the Sanhedrin, which administers Torah law all the time. And then there's a separate standalone system of justice, which is the Mishpat HaMelucha, which is the judgment of the king, where the king sometimes has to punish individuals who might not have two witnesses that saw the crime that was committed, but you're going to follow all of the strict details and dictates of Torah law, so you might have chaos in a society from a law and order perspective. So in order to ensure that there be law and order in society, so the Melech, the king, has the discretion to add special enactments and the special measures in order to preserve law and order of a society. But the king might get carried away and think, so the king is also going to administer just regular cases that don't require extrajudicial measures, and that everything shall be in accordance with some type of an arbitrary system or some sort of a non-Torah system. So therefore, that's why, says the Ran, that the king had this special commandment, that the king had to carry with him all of it. He had to carry the Sefer Torah and remember of the mitzvahs of the Torah all the time, so he'll understand that he himself is meshubad, that he himself is subservient to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's sovereignty and to all of the laws of the Torah, despite his extrajudicial jurisdiction that he is given. Kolmar, says the Ran, since he knows that he does have extrajudicial powers, therefore he needs this special additional commandment, the Vilti Yasam in a mitzvah yom and small, that he is not supposed to view himself as above and greater than the Torah, that he can somehow take measures on his own, which are not in accordance with the Torah in his personal behavior. But rather, he's supposed to comport himself according to the Torah. He's supposed to have respect for the Torah system of law, so when there are regular cases, it should go to the Sanhedrin, it should go to the regular Batei Din, it shouldn't go to some sort of a bagatz that you create that's going to decide cases according to Turkish law, Ottoman law, British law, whatever. Everything should be decided according to halacha. That is the way in which a Jewish government is supposed to be set up, and that's why the king himself has to be reminded of this truism, and that is a part of this idea that it's important to preserve, paramount to preserve this quality of Yirah Shamayim, respect for the Torah, respect for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and respect for the Torah, with respect to somebody being a king. This requires a tzidkus, it requires a certain righteousness on the part of a king. This actually led to a very interesting discussion about Yerusha in general nowadays, where we don't have a king per se, but we have Man Malchi Rabbanon, who are considered to be sort of our kings. So the Rabbanim, the Chachamim, the rabbis. So is there a concept of Yerushin Rabbanus? That if somebody is a rabbi of a shul, rabbi of a community, does that pass down to their children? And there's a very lengthy tshuva that was written by the Avnei Nes, the Sakhachever Rebbe, called Sheish Ma'alos L'Kiseh. She wrote about this particular subject, in which he is inclined to say that there is such a notion. He paskins like the Rivash and the Mabit against the opinion of the Chassam Sofer in this respect, that the position of being a rabbi does pass down from the father to the children, even though Kesed Torah, on one level, you could say it's that everybody who wants to be great in Torah has the opportunity to do so, regardless of who their father or grandfather happened to be. But for a position of Rabbanus, so he felt that it does go B'Yerusha. But there is a secondary consideration he throws in, and this we'll see is true even with respect to the Melech. He says, yes, a person certainly has to be Malim Makom Avosa. So he says that if a rabbi has a son who's also learned and also capable of the job, so he gets first dibs, then he would be given the position. But there is something else the Avnei Nezer doesn't personally touch upon, but when he published the Chuvos, so he had a son. The son was a famous Hasidic Rebbe known as the Shem Mishmuel. The Shem Mishmuel, when he was writing down his father's Chuvos, so he wrote Amar Shmuel. He has like in the brackets, he said, yeah, my father said it goes B'Yerusha as long as the son is worthy, but there's a caveat. There's one little additional wrinkle. What's that additional wrinkle? That is, he said that it has to be that somebody wants this person to be the Rav. If nobody in the congregation wants the person to be the Rav, you can't be the Rav. That you have to be, number one, be fit for the task, but number two, you have to be desired by the congregation. He says you need either Rav Minyan or Rav Binyan. Either you need the majority of the congregants of the Kehillah that want this person to be Rav, or at least Rav Binyan. What's Rav Binyan? Some say Rav Binyan means, the majority of the weight of the congregation, the menalim, the directors, the movers and the shakers. You could say in certain communities, maybe the machers, those who are really running the show from behind the scenes or in front of the scenes. But the big movers and shakers, at least you need the majority of the big movers and shakers. You could say maybe if you're looking at it from an American political point of view, you need either the popular vote or the electoral vote. You need something. You're not going to have anything, so then it doesn't really matter whether the father of this individual was the Rav. You don't get to be Rav. And this really echoes something which the Netziv points about. The Netziv speaks about of Tali Sri Yehuda Berlin in his commentary to the Torah, that source Saches, where he says that even the appointment of a king is something that requires a democratic process. Said that for 300 years, the Aaron was sitting in the Mishkan in Shiloh, and they never appointed a king. And you don't find that the people who were guilty of any Avera, when they wanted to appoint the king, Shmuel and Navi complained, why do you want to appoint a king? What am I not good enough for you? The Ran says, because they wanted to appoint a king, not only to administer the Mishpat HaMelech, but also to administer the regular laws. They didn't want to have any Torah system whatsoever. So that's the reason why Shmuel got upset with him. It says that the Netziv, that really it wasn't a problem not to have a king all those years. It's a mitzvah to have a king, but it's only a mitzvah to have a king if the people want a king. He says that because Venira, there's a difference between whether a country is run by a king or run by political officers who are re-elected every few years or so. You sometimes can have a country where the kings are going to be tyrants, they're going to be totalitarians, and it's not going to work. It's going to be terrible for the Melucha. And then there are countries where if you don't have a king, because there's such terrible things going around you, and there's such warfare and dictatorships and so forth, that if you're not going to have a strong king, you're not going to be able to contend with them. You'll be like a ship without a captain. So he says that that's a determination the population has to make. Population has to make a decision whether they are going to appoint a king or not. And therefore, he says that Sanhedrin Mitzuvin, that the Sanhedrin that is are the ones who are enjoined to appoint somebody to be the king. It's not Ad Sheyomu Am Sherotzim Anhogas Melech. It's only when the people say that they want a king. The people say that they don't want a king, so then there's no king. So then Sid points out that this is the way that we run things in general, even when it comes to a monarchy. We run this, that we require, number one, the king be fit, and number two, that you have an individual who's desired by the people. If you're going to have a king, so even the monarchy itself has to be desired by the people. Otherwise, in terms of how we run our communities nowadays, so the Ramah in Choshim Mishpah Siman Kuf Sama Gimel says that if you have tzachit tzibur she'ein yochon lahashvos atzmon, if you have needs, community needs, where there isn't a consensus as to what to do. So what do? You get everybody, all the taxpayers together. You got to pay tax at least to be able to vote. Everybody should say what they want. Everybody should vote. And then you follow the Ilcha Charahov, you follow majority rule. We're not reading the Constitution. We're not reading the Federalist letters over here. We're reading the Ramah. The Ramah says that we follow democratic principles. in halacha. You set up a political system, you follow majority vote. Just one caveat of what the Rama requires, that when they vote, it has to be l'shem shemayim. Not only does it have to be l'shem shemayim when they vote, but the leaders themselves, as we mentioned before, they have to be fit. So that's why the Ramon Koshim Mishpat Siman Lamed Zayin says that if you have Tuvei HaKahal, you have the leaders of the congregation who are appointed, and that he says that they're like Dayanim, that they are not allowed you're not allowed to appoint people who do not have impeccable character. If somebody who's pasal ladun mishum risha, somebody who has risha, somebody who commits avera, somebody who's a wicked scoundrel, so you're not allowed to have such a person in a position of leadership. So we have two things. The voters have a certain responsibility to act l'shem shemayim for the sake of heaven, and you have to have leaders who themselves are people of integrity and honor and follow the Torah. The Chazon Ish codifies this in his commentary in Baba Basset, source Yud Aleph. If the political leaders are not any good in terms of their conduct, and they weren't chosen for lofty reasons, so he says he considers that type of an election to be completely null and void. There's a Chuvas Ksam Sofer. Chuvas Ksam Sofer talks about an election of a Rav in a particular community where there was hanky-panky going on. There were 4 individuals who were the finalists, and they decided this is the way they were going to elect the Rav. Very interesting, but you'll say that's very peculiar and crazy, but nothing, so spectacularly different from the way the shul boards, behave nowadays. So he said, we'll have 4 candidates, and we'll have some sort of a raffle as to which one you'll take out of the raffle, different names, and whichever name is taken first, everybody will vote. If that person gets majority vote, he'll be the rabbi. Forget the other 3 whose name wasn't chosen, okay? And then he doesn't get majority vote, you take another ticket out of the hat, it's another candidate's name, and then the majority votes for that person. And if he doesn't get a majority, so he's not the rabbi. And then you keep on doing it until somebody gets the majority. That's the way it was structured. So the first and second candidates didn't get a majority. The third candidate got a majority. But then it turned out that there were rumors that were going around that some of the voters from the congregation only voted for this third candidate because they were bribed by members of that rabbi's family. So now the question became, was this considered to be a valid vote or not? Let's say that the ones who were bribed were only a mute. They were only a small percentage. And even if you didn't count them, the third candidate would have gotten a majority. So Ksam Sofer says the election is null and void. The election is null and void, he said. Why is it null and void? Because he said that even if it was only a minority that voted in this particular fashion because they were affected by the bribe, it could be that affected the way they voted for the first 2 candidates. And that if they hadn't been bribed, then one of the first 2 candidates would have gotten a majority based on their votes, but that they abstained from the first 2 candidates because they knew that they had an allegiance to vote for the third candidate. It's kind of like when we would choose people in the Smicha program at Yeshiva. I remember when I was Menayel, and we would vote for which students are going to be admitted into the Kol Elyon. So if any of the Rosh Yeshiva, who normally would vote on the students, had a son who was one of the candidates, which would happen not so infrequently, so then they would be disqualified from voting that year. So the suggestion was made, maybe they can't vote for their own son, but they could vote for one of the other candidates. So I pointed out, you can't really do it that way either, because even though Chas v'Shalom, you never suspect, anybody of having such a thought process. But if you knew by not voting for this person, so the other person will get more votes, so that also potentially can affect the vote. So therefore, to be above any type of reproach or suspicion, person wouldn't be allowed to vote at all. So says the Ksam Sofer, the same idea with respect to the political election for the Rav, that if they were affected by shokad, so the whole election is null and void. And the Ksam Sofer points out that this is even if the rabbi is otherwise qualified. We have that. The Gemara says explicitly that the wife of Yeshua ben Gamla, who was a big Talmid Chacham, the wife of Yeshua ben Gamla gave a tirkava de dinri. She gave a huge amount of money in order to buy her husband the Kahuna Gedola. And the Gemara says it was null and void because of the fact that he was appointed based on essentially this payment of money, call it a bribe, that was given by his wife. We'll assume he didn't authorize it, but nonetheless, since it was done under improper circumstances, therefore the entire election is null and void. And any rabbi who would participate in this type of a scheme, he says, obviously would be invalidated, and any voter would be invalidated. And he quotes the Mama, says, you can't appoint the rabbi under those circumstances. If somebody would take a bribe, so then they are not allowed to be involved in even the selection of a candidate. So, Hershel Schachter Shlita, my Rebbe.
Froze. Zoom is frozen.
That is considered to be perfectly legitimate because it's coming from within yourself and your own agenda. But if your agenda is based upon the fact that somebody has paid you off, that somebody has given you a bribe, it's coming from the outside, it's not coming from within. So that is the very definition of something which is not l'shem. It's not considered to be l'shem shemayim. So this is with respect to sort of like the basic criteria of how you go about an honest election, how you end up being a proper candidate. But there's more to it as well, which is that we know that we have a principle that we learn in Pirkei Avos, Rabbanos, Mekaveres is Be'aleh, that the Rabbanos that you're going to have a position of authority. So this has this is a statement of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbanos Mekaveres is Be'aleh. So it's a statement that means, as the Meforshim explained to Paris Yisrael and others, that if you conduct yourself, you have a position of power, and you conduct yourself in a haughty and heavy-handed fashion, so then that leads to a terrible sin, and it leads to all kinds of terrible punishments, including premature death, according to the Gemara. And this is a violation of what we refer to as, with the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, what it says is Sanei Rabbanut. It goes together, that you should hate the Rabbanut. Does that mean you should hate being a rabbi? So it doesn't mean you should hate being a rabbi. It's good to be a rabbi, but it means that you shouldn't be either a rabbi, as the Tiferes Yisrael says, that goes into the rabbinate for your own self-aggrandizement, and in order to impose yourself upon the tzibur against the will, and in order to trample upon the rights of others. But if you're doing it in order to advance justice and in order to advance the Torah, so then that's a beautiful thing. And says that the Tiferes Yisrael, same is true of any rabbinical, of any political leader. That if you're the Gemara says in a number of places that one thing that a Kadosh Baruch Hu does not want, and the Gemara Chagiga says he cries over, is a parnas hamisgar letzibur. You have a leader a violation of a Kadosh Baruch Hu's trust. And it's interesting, the Maharshal points out that an example or a proof text of the fact that going into the Rabbanos going into a position of political authority, simple interpretation of Rabbanut, is an example of that is Yosef Atzadik. We see Yosef Atzadik died at the age of 110. It says, as the Gemara says, the Gemara in Brachos Daf Nun Hey and Aleph, and that was an earlier age of death than his brother. So why did he die young? Because it says the Gemara because he was a political leader. So the Maharshal says that's not to say that Yosef Atzadik violated any of these different criteria of being a political leader. It means that because the Torah goes out of its way to kind of tell us that Yosef was died first, and only afterwards Yosef's brothers died after him. So it's to teach us a general lesson, even though it doesn't pertain to Yosef per se. Yosef was an admirable, righteous leader, but it's to teach us in general that being in politics is a very, very perilous thing in terms of people going into it for the wrong reasons and becoming power hungry. And as we know, there's a general saying that power corrupts. But at the same time, the Gemara in Yuma says Yosef, even though he had certain tendencies of a Yetzer Hara, especially in his youth, he was able to overcome those Yetzer Haras, and therefore Yosef is a Machayev is Rishoim. Yosef Atzadik is somebody that if the Rishoim say that when they go to heaven, they couldn't, when they get judged whether to go to heaven or not, and they say, oh, well, I couldn't control my Yetzer Hara because of the fact that I was so good looking and I had such taivas or whatever. So the answer will be, well, look at Yosef Atzadik. Yosef Atzadik was able to control his Yetzer Hara, so and despite the fact that it was also very strong, and therefore says the Gemara that Yosef Atzadik is Mechayev es Rishoim. So I would like to suggest, just sort of as like a side point, that the way that Yosef was Mechayev es Rishoim. So my father's Zechron al-Bacha, since it is a Yahrtzeit Shiur in his honor, he is Mechayev es politicians. That my father showed that you could be a politician and you don't. I never saw him speak badly about anybody. Never get involved in backstabbing. Never get involved in any kind of tricky, conniving political machinations. He was always, oh, how can I create more sidewalks so it's going to be a safer place? How can I get people to wear the yellow safety sashes? How can I plant more trees so the streets will look nicer? That was every conversation that he had. It was the most incredible thing, but somehow miraculously he got elected anyway. And time again, he was always the biggest vote getter among everybody who ran for town council. That it is possible, and that's what the Torah tells us. You shouldn't give up on the possibility of being a righteous politician. That's the way that we're supposed to conduct ourselves, and it is a possibility to be a righteous politician, a righteous person in politics, and to ask for that and to have an expectation of that. It doesn't mean like the Ramban wrote in this past week's parashah, Parshas Pinchas, when Moshe Rabbeinu appointed Yehoshua, and it says that Tziviso so Leinehem, he's going to command them to the eyes of in front of all the people. And Rashi says, yeah, you have to command Yehoshua. You should know that these people are Tachanim and they're Savonim. They're very difficult, obstinate people, and it's Amanas Kain. And it's with that understanding that you're going into office, Ramban says that wouldn't be a good thing to say in the presence of all the people, because it encourages them to, in fact, be difficult and obstinate. So the Ramban says that what he was really telling Yehoshua was that the mitzvah Tanagin, that you have to be strong, you have to not fear the people. But that means be strong and not fear the people when the people are pushing you to do something which is naughty, to do something which is wrong. Like the people would push my father to say, oh, you should provide for a zoning allowance of a 10-story high-rise building in a place which is supposed to be a park. So you have to be able to stand your ground and stand up for principles. But that's really the idea. A leader is supposed to be strong in terms of standing up for Torah principles, not be strong in terms of being just a very selfish and haughty and heavy-handed. So that's exactly what's supposed to be avoided. That's what the Gemara refers to. And the Gemara says that we have a contrast in terms of the Parnas Hamiskayas at Tzibor, Hamiskayal at Tzibor, the Parnas who lords himself over the congregation. We have sort of the contrasting example of a proper behavior of a leader, which is a Parnas Hamaningus at Tzibor Benachas, a Parnas leader who leads the congregation very, very, very gently and kindly, and that is sort of the example of somebody who really has the interest of the Tzibor at heart, the way in which a leader is supposed to conduct himself. Now, with this sort of introduction aside, how does this impact how we should vote? So certainly, when it comes to a Jewish king and a Jewish community leader, it should impact our vote in terms of seeing to it that you're voting at the very least for Yarei Shemayim. There's an interesting quote from 2012. Actually, I saw this in a source sheet that was generated by Rabbi Mordechai Torachino. It's a quote from the Ami magazine of 2012 from Rabbi Meyer Schwab. I think that's the son of Rabbi Shimon Schwab. So Rabbi Meyer Schwab says, he says there's a Chil Hashem consideration in terms of how Jews vote. If it would come out that the Frum Jews voted for and put into office someone whose behavior was despicable by all standards of humanity, that decent people everywhere consider abominable, if it became known that the Frum Jews of Borough Park or Muncie or New York voted for him, it would be a Chil Hashem, and a Chil Hashem trumps everything. That's interesting because he got both Obama and Trump into this quote. But he says that one thing that you have to take very strongly into consideration is there's a Chillul Hashem element that we stand for something. We stand for integrity. We stand for certain principles. So that's something that certainly should be a factor when you are voting for a political candidate. But sometimes how to weigh Chillul Hashem requires careful consideration. Because Chillul Hashem could be that a certain person acts very much like a scoundrel, but Chillul Hashem could also be in terms of electing somebody who's going to further a political position, which is very detrimental to Torah and very, very detrimental to Israel, very detrimental to everything that we stand for. So we have to be very, very mindful about what exactly would qualify as a Chillul Hashem, and that might vary based on the circumstances. There's a question: is there a place for pragmatic voting? Like you feel that really there's nothing good to vote for, but nonetheless, if you don't vote, you're not going to be able to have any impact. But if you vote, you'll be able to have some sort of a positive impact. So this is something, interestingly, that the Steipler Gaon spoke about. The Steipler Gaon, who we know is not a big fan of the Medina per se, so he had this correspondence in his Sefer Kleine Digarta, the collection of the Steipler's letters. He has a correspondence with somebody who was more right-wing than the Steipler himself, if you can imagine such a thing. Maybe somebody more in the Turi Karta territory who felt that you shouldn't vote altogether because they didn't hold by the Medina. And the Steipler Gaon said, no, you don't understand. It's a tremendous mitzvah to vote because he says that mitzvah rabba latzpia, the Veshima Acharedis, as long as you vote for an agenda that's going to further Torah. You're worried that the Medina is not following Torah, so at least then get involved. If you're not happy with the current situation, so vote and be involved. And this is saving the religion. So there is such a notion as voting for pragmatic purposes. He noted that even in terms of serving in the government, the son of the Chassam Sofer served in the parliament in Europe. I'm not sure which country, maybe Poland, maybe a different country, but he served in the parliament, Rav Shimon Sofer, even though he was surrounded by Rishoyim, because of the fact that it was important to further the agenda of the Jewish community. And now, it doesn't necessarily mean that whatever happens to be the party that the Steipler Gaon was pushing is the party that one has to vote for. The one has to vote for any particular party. In general, we don't get up and say to people, you have to vote this way, you have to vote that way. But Moshe Feinstein had a very interesting letter that he signed towards the end of his life in October 3rd, 1984. I think when was he nifter of Moshe in 86? I think in 86, I believe. So Moshe Feinstein signed this letter. It's not in his handwriting, but he signed the letter, and it's about the importance of voting for the sake of voting. On reaching the shores of the United States, Jews found a safe haven. The rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights have allowed us the freedom to practice our religion without interference and to live in this republic in safety. A fundamental principle of Judaism is hakaras hatov, recognizing benefits afforded us and giving expression to our appreciation. Therefore, it is incumbent upon each Jewish citizen to participate in the democratic system which guards the freedoms we enjoy. So he felt that it was just important to vote in order to promote democracy, in order to promote the democratic system. I'll say as an aside, please don't get me into trouble over this. This has nothing to do with which a political candidate to vote for. And I'll give you an anecdote to show that it has nothing to do with that. But I do feel that it is very important to support and promote the principles of democracy, certainly in the United States, which has been very, very good to the Jewish community in terms of enabling us, based on the principles of democracy, to exercise our free exercise of religion, to be able to practice our Judaism without interferences and encumbrances and so forth. So therefore, I do feel that it is important for political candidates, whether they're Republican or Democrat, it doesn't really matter. But if there is a properly held democratic election, which is something that furthers the principles of government by the people, of the people, for the people, et cetera, so it is important to recognize the results of that election. That I do feel. I feel that if a political candidate loses, it's very important that they should concede the election. I'll tell you that after Donald Trump lost the election 4 years ago, I was very upset at him because I felt that he accomplished so many good things during his presidency, whatever you think of his personal conduct and so forth, but certainly you could support Abraham Accords, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, all of these good things. I said, you're ruining it. But by not upholding this basic principle of democracy, it's so important to recognize like the results of an election. You challenge in the Supreme Court, you lost a little challenge. It's such an important thing. So I felt I need to talk to him. So I was thinking, what do? I'll call him. I'm a citizen, of the country, so I get to talk to my president. Isn't that like something, one of the things that you can do? So I didn't know what number to call. So I tried to call. I said, what's the number of the White House or whatever. I tried to get through. I couldn't get through to him. such a strange thing. You can't get his number anywhere. So finally, I found like some sort of a number. Maybe it goes to the chief of staff's office or something. So you could leave a message over here. So I left a message, and I said all this to him. I said, listen, if you're listening to this message, very important. I really respect so much that he's done. So please don't ruin your legacy. Just concede the election. You lost the election. It's very important for democracy. I don't know if he got the message, but I did leave that message. I feel that's very. You can't say, "Oh, the election is rigged." If the other guy if the other guy wins, but if my guy wins, then automatically it's not rigged. That's bad for democracy. So I think that this was basically what Rav Moshe was saying as well. That you have to promote principles of democracy. And again, please, it's not an endorsement of any candidate. It's just something that I feel strongly about. It's like when I have a divorce case. I feel strongly a get should be given. It's not because I'm favoring the wife, not because I'm favoring the husband. If one wants to get, one doesn't want to get. I feel it's important when a couple gets divorced that each party should cooperate with respect to the get. I'm in favor of the get. I'm not in favor of this candidate, that candidate. I'm in favor of furthering and promoting principles of democracy. So by the same token, it's also very important to understand that the Torah does not endorse a particular political view, a particular political candidate, and we don't idolize individuals either. We don't idolize individuals. We don't demonize individuals. So you might have political movements that are demonizing a particular person. Don't go along with it. That's not the Torah way. The politicians themselves don't matter so much. You're not supposed to place your faith. The Pirkei Avos says, don't get too cozy with the government because they're nice to you when it's good for them, and then when they decide that it's more expedient not to be good to you, so they're not going to be so nice to you anymore. So therefore, you shouldn't get this. Rabbi Yona points out you shouldn't get so carried away with them, even though we have a principle of Yechanias Kana Kohanim. If him ispalo b'shlomo shemalko shemali mora shemalko zisha Israel kaim below, that if you have to pray for the welfare of the government, because otherwise everybody would just eat each other up alive. I think we see they eat each other up alive anyway. But imagine if we wouldn't be praying every single Shabbos for Shlomo Shamalkos, it'd be much worse. Despite all of that, it says Rabbi Yona that when you daven, you don't daven to the government. You daven for the welfare of the government, but you daven to a Kadosh Baruch Hu. You daven to a Kadosh Baruch Hu that he should inspire the elected members of the government to do the right thing and to have the right policies and to have the right perspective and to have the right foreign policy, the right domestic policy, to deal with all of the foreign threats that are out there, with all of the scary governments of the world, and to have a proper economic policy. So that's something you dive into a Kadosh Baruch Hu. The pasuk in Mishlei says, "Palgei mayim leiv melech b'yad Hashem akosh yakvos yatenu." They're like a little rivulets, little small streams of water that go this way and that way to nourish different areas. So too, a Kadosh Baruch Hu tilts the hearts of those in government to make certain decisions. That ultimately you have to be pragmatic in terms of thinking about who's going to be the best for your interest and who's not going to lead to a Chilul Hashem and promotes the principles that you want to promote and so forth. And also to show that you're participating in the democratic process, like Moshe said. But ultimately, when you're davening, you have to daven to a Kadosh Baruch Hu. There's a statement, a comment that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky makes that I think is very instructive in this regard. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, this is source Chavches on the pasuk Yadin Hashem Amav Efes Hatzor V'Yazub, says the Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to judge the people. And not that anybody, that it's ultimately going to depend upon whether our enemies do this or whether we prevail over our enemies this way or that way. But ultimately, it's a Kadosh Baruch Hu that's going to be calling the shots. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky points out that there's a Gemara in Sanhedrin that says, "Ein ben David bar she's yashim in the Gula," that the Mashiach's not going to come until we give up hope from the Gula coming. So what a strange thing, he says. How could the Gemara say that? It's one of the 13 Ikari Emunah, that we hope for Mashiach every day. What do you mean? Mashiach only comes when we give up hope that Mashiach's going to come? So he says, no. I think what it means is, whenever we expect the Gula to come sort of in a natural way, that we expect the nations of the world to have a pity on us, and that the headlines will actually say, "Oh, Hamas is bad, Israel is good. Have we all lost our minds?" No, if we keep on waiting for that, We're waiting for them to validate our actions and so forth. That's not the way that the gula comes. That's not the way that redemption comes. We're hated. If you haven't figured it out before, you can figure out this past year. It's only back in this yayish. It's only when we give up hope and from these illusions and delusions, and we understand that we can only really rely upon HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's when Ben David is going to come. That's when the Mashiach is going to come. I brought various quotations that we don't really have a time for from Sikas Musar that was given by Rabbi Jeremy Weider in the YU-based Medrash in 2019, in which he points out that a Torah Jew is not about being a Republican or a Democrat, but rather being a Torah Jew, and that the Torah is nuanced. It's neither Republican nor Democrat. It's certainly not this candidate or that candidate, and that we have to understand that the Torah stands apart from the course of political discourse that surrounds us. And a similar letter by my good friend Shiur Carroll from the Wall Street Journal, 2012, in which he makes a similar statement in response to some very fine Rav who had written about that the Torah teaches us that capitalism is a positive value. And of course, it is a positive value, but it's not that the Torah, he points out, it's not that Judaism endorses capitalism, just like Judaism does not culminate in socialism, but we have a complex, nuanced system of laws in which we have annulments of debts in the Shemitah year, we have return of the land in the Yovel year, but we have a certain proper laws that have to be followed when it comes to labor relations, that it is much more nuanced, and that to equate the Bible with a single form of economic theory is to force Judaism into a Procrustean bed. Procrusteus was this person who we know fitted people into a bed, and if they were too tall, he made them short. If they were too short, he would make them longer and kill people that way and torture people that way. So we don't believe in that. The Torah does not get fit into whether it's Trump or Harris or the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or whatever it happens to be. The Torah remains intact and sacrosanct, and should not be tainted by the pettiness of politics. The Trumas Hadeshin points out, source 11 Aleph, this is so important. Trumas Hadeshin points out that one very important thing in Judaism about politics is don't over obsess about politics. We pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, don't have your entire discourse about politics. He speaks about, are you allowed to discuss politics at the Shabbos table? This is a Rishon. What is he, 15th century? So Trumas Hadeshin asks the question, are you allowed to discuss politics at the Shabbos table? So he says that if it would give you owning Shabbos, I guess you could discuss politics at the Shabbos table. Really, Shabbos is the time that you're supposed to be quiet and not talk too much. But he said, invariably, if you're going to discuss politics at the Shabbos table, you're going to cause agmas nefesh to somebody at the table. So therefore, he says, you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. So in my home, we have a chumrah. As a siyag b'Torah, we don't discuss politics the entire week. It's something which I can guarantee you, it leads to a much more harmonious family atmosphere, and you'll find that if you avoid constant talk about politics with your friends and family, you'll be on a loftier plane in general. But to understand, we shouldn't lower ourselves in terms of identifying ourselves with a particular person or a particular political party. But one thing that is important is the pragmatism. There are stories in the Gemara regarding Baba Ben Buta, when he saw that Hordus was killing all of the rabbis, and Hordus said, what can I do to redeem myself? And he saw it as an opportunity to say, oh, well, you should rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, make the Beis HaMikdash nicer. And the Gemara says it was a pragmatic thing for him to take advantage of his political clout, because otherwise the Beis HaMikdash would not have been restored, it would not have been renovated. And similarly with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he was the time of the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, but then when he was snuck out of Yerushalayim, and he gave proper greetings to Vespasian as he was made into the Roman ruler. And Vespasian said, oh, what can I do for you? And he pragmatically said, well, enable me to keep the Torah going. Just, I know I can't stop you necessarily. Gemara questions, maybe he could have, but he felt he couldn't stop him from destroying the Beis HaMikdash. Hatzalah porta mi'ahave. He can have at least a little hatzalah that what we need, what's most essential for the eternity of the Jewish people is to keep the Torah going. So therefore, he gave him that one request, since he was told he would be granted a request. And based on that request, that he was able to keep the legacy of Torah going, which of course is the legacy of Klal Yisrael. So the idea that we should take advantage of whatever clout we have in order to promote Torah, in order to promote pragmatic policies, this certainly is something which is admirable and something which is appropriate. And we also have a certain responsibility. I'll just conclude with this, that Nehemiah was a major political figure in the Melech's house, in Melech's palace in Babel, between the period of the first destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash and the rebuilding of the second Beis HaMikdash. And despite the fact that Nehemiah had a very cozy position, you think about Jews in the United States where things are sometimes relatively cozy. You're able to get your tax breaks and you're able to get your tuition vouchers and whatever else from the government. So you can lose sight sometimes of the big picture. One thing that Nehemiah did not lose sight of, the Chassam Sofer makes note of this, is that he used his political clout not only from a pragmatic perspective, but a sense of responsibility. He turned to that he had a sorrowful face, and the Melech said to him that Madua lo yiru, and he said, why is it that Madua panacha ra'im? Why is it that you have such a sorrowful face? And Nehemiah said, how can I not have a sorrowful face? When the place, my homeland, where my forefathers are buried, is completely destroyed, and we're not able to have a proper Beis HaMikdash. The gates of the city of Yerushalayim have sunk into the ground and been destroyed by fire, and we're not able to restore our sovereignty. And what did the Melech say? The Melech said, oh, okay, so if that's the case, so then tell me what you need and how much money and what letters of support you need, and I'll send you over to that country, and I'll see to it that they listen to your request and they'll help you rebuild the homeland of your destinies. The Chassam Sofer said this to the some of the original leaders of the Reform movement who wanted to change a certain synagogue liturgy to take out in the synagogue liturgy that we're praying for the restoration of Shiur of Yerushalayim. So the Chassam Sofer says that you're going to say, what do we need it for? Because we're sitting here in our diaspora so securely. He said, Chas v'sholom, this is the main thing that we need. The life, the illusory life that we have in Golus is not what we're praying for. Kol Yameinu. What matters to us is that we be restored to our promised land, and that we be able to, and this is something which is respected by all of the nations of the world. They respect the right of the Jewish people to assert our sovereignty and to have pride in our land and in our heritage and in our legacy, and to want to go back to Eretz Yisrael and to keep Eretz Yisrael intact. Once we decide that we're going to compromise on that, so that's a very, very dangerous thing. So this, even though Nehemiah, by asserting himself, you could say it was a certain danger, when Esther Malka asserted herself, maybe there was a certain danger. We have a responsibility to stand up for Klal Yisrael. We have this responsibility to stand up for Eretz Yisrael, like Netanyahu's speech. I thought was very good that he gave to Congress last week. The Chassam Sofer says it's not only good for us, it's good for the nations of the world too. When we have a Beis HaMikdash, and we're in Eretz Yisrael, the pasuk says that it's going to illuminate and lighten up the lives of the other nations of the world as well when we are in the right place. Our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory. So this is something that we all have to declare. We have to proclaim very, very proudly, and we have to proclaim very loudly when we are involved in political voting, and it's something which should also be part of our political calculus. However, do not be misled into thinking that the answer is going to necessarily be this candidate or that candidate. Sometimes I remember when I was younger, when George Bush became president, and everybody was terrified that there was the fellow who was pushing for him when he needed Florida to win the election. And so his main spokesperson was a fellow named James Baker at the time. James Baker was famous for making a certain statement, expletive the Jews. So people thought that, he's going to be running the country, this James Baker, and it's going to be very anti-Semitic. And George W. Bush turned out to be probably the greatest friend of the Jews of any president that we've had over the past 100 years, arguably. And therefore, the main thing is that we should ensure that we're thinking about all the right issues, that we're thinking them through carefully, and that we ultimately are not looking to particular people or candidates or parties, but rather to a Kadosh Baruch Hu. The Stipler says that the guiding principle is Uvachatah b'chayim. The Stipler meant Uvachatah b'chayim. You should choose life, so choose Aguda. Okay, so it could be that's one interpretation, and maybe in certain circumstances that was correct for the elections that he was talking about. But overall, Uvachatah b'chayim means like the pasuk says that Nasati l'panecha sachayim esatov. The Kadosh Baruch Hu has put in front of us life and good. What is life and good? Torah mitzvos, the Klal Yisrael, our Yerushalayim. These are the good things that we have to focus upon. And midos tovos, and good character, the character that it takes to be a proper member and a proper spokesperson for Klal Yisrael. And Yechiel Michal, I think you would agree with that. Therefore, that has to be sort of our lodestar, is in terms of recognizing that our job is to be an Or L'Goyim, a light upon nations, not only in terms of the way in which we conduct ourselves day in and day out, but even the way that we approach political elections as well. We should be above the fray. And focus upon what's really important. And we should, even if we support certain things about certain candidates, if there are other things that we don't support, so we don't have to take the whole picture. We can give the message of Torah mitzvahs. This is what Torah mitzvahs is all about. So bottom line, number one, we require that l'shem shemayim, that everything should be for the sake of heaven, both in terms of the way the candidate comports himself or herself, and the way in which the voter conducts himself or herself. Number two, that we don't idolize any particular party, and we're not part of any lynch mob mentality either against candidates from a different party. We don't worship candidates and we don't demonize candidates. Number three, we should comport ourselves with honesty, integrity, and in accordance with Torah values and ideals. Those ideals also include being pragmatic about what's going to advance the principle of our community and what's going to advance the values of Torah mitzvahs. And we also have responsibility to stand up for Eretz Yisrael and for the very lifeline of Klal Yisrael when we are in danger, like we are right now, whether as voters, as politicians, or as advocates of political policies. We have to always conduct ourselves according to the principle that you have to remember that
just leave me a little bit of room. I'll stand here.
At the same time, the part of that holiness is that we also recognize that we only have a Kodesh Baruch Hu to
Thank you.
With this in mind, and with this approach, we should all be zocheh to be as Mashiach ben David, Meher b'Yameinu, and V'Akiyim during this dark period of the 3 weeks and this time of peril. For Klal Yisrael of Be'afakti Evlam L'Sason Minikamtim Misimachtim Migonam. Thank you very much.